Hi everyone, this is Benjamin Carstens, and this is my presentation for CS525 Special Topics Digital Forensics. And my presentation is about social media forensics. So the kind of the overview and the content of my presentation. First, we'll look at the kind of the definition of social media and its rise in popularity. Then we'll look at what social media forensics is and kind of define that. We'll look at what type of information and data can be gathered by using social media forensics. We'll look at the tools and techniques that are used to gather this data and information. And then we'll look at the legality of the practice and whether or not the evidence gathered can be actually used in court and in investigations. And then we'll look at some examples of where evidence has either been accepted or not accepted and used in court cases. And then obviously I have references at the end. So I'm sure many of us could probably give a basic definition of what social media is. I happen to have one here that kind of is a very rigid and kind of particular definition of social media, but I'm sure many of us could provide something based on our experiences that kind of fits more or less what this says. This definition is social media is any application or website that facilitates users to interact and socialize, share ideas and information, upload photos and files, participate in various activities or events, and engage in real-time conversations. The use of dedicated websites and applications to interact with other users or to find people with similar interests to one's own. So again, many of us has probably had numerous experiences and still probably every day use social media in some regard. And I think really we could probably provide our own definitions. But this could obviously vary on potentially what platform you're using. Obviously, down below you kind of have a list of some of the platforms. Specifically Facebook, kind of used for staying in touch with friends and family, looking at what's going on in people's lives. YouTube is something you can use for entertainment and/or learning. People can post about their hobbies. If they're into cooking or if they're into fixing cars, and you can either use it for entertainment or to learn and interact with people that way. Twitter is kind of, I guess, a way for people to kind of share their thoughts in the moment. Whether or not people want to hear them, obviously, is a different matter. You have LinkedIn that can, be used to stay in contact and connect with people in your business or your associates or your coworkers, or find new connections, even job searching. Snapchat kind of used for maybe funny content, sharing funny moments with friends and people. Instagram as well, obviously used to share life moments, and obviously you have a big marketing push on Instagram as well, with influencers and people sharing their experiences and their products. So kind of a wide variety of social media types. Again, I'm sure we all have had some experience with that in some regard. So kind of crazy how social media has taken off in the last, specifically this graph on the side is 13 years, but really probably 15 years or so, from 2005 or so to 2020. Obviously this graph only goes to 2018, but you could extrapolate it and take it out to 2020, and it would probably look relatively similar. You'd see the same trends. You really have billions of users on the top platforms. If you look at Instagram and Facebook, they have over 1 billion, up to 2 billion people. You've really seen linear growth, especially for the top platforms, in the last 13 to 15 years. And it's kind of crazy because if you look at Facebook and you view it as a country, it has over 2 billion users, so that would make it the third largest country in the world, behind India and China. And that's larger than the U.S. and and Europe's population combined. So you really see just what the reach of social media is, and how much it really permeates to many people in the world and our culture. And it's really part of, I think it's really ingrained in the identity of society nowadays. And I'd say even more so for a younger generation that grew up and knows nothing else but social media. I know for myself, I can remember when we didn't have internet. I remember when we had dial-up internet when we first got it, and I remember when social media wasn't a thing. and can specifically remember creating my MySpace and my Facebook profile, and I remember a world before social media, and obviously it looked very different than the world that we have now, for better and for worse. But I think going forward, you have many people that will not know that, and it's just obviously part of our society. So very interesting, just how far it's reached, and what it's brought to society. So specifically, we'll get into that. All that being said, what type of information can you get from social media, and then what is social media forensics, and what type of information are investigators looking at? So specifically, social media forensics is really just, kind of what it sounds like. It's using social media platforms to investigate people and to gather information and data on them, and then it's compiling that evidence to be used in some sort of legal process, whether that's criminal or not. And all of that, obviously, the process which is used and kind of the data that can be gathered is dependent on the platform and what is being investigated, and we'll kind of get into that. But really, I think you can break it down into kind of, I was able to find really four main uses where it seems like this is used. Maybe a fifth that I'll talk about on the next slide, but really you have the four main ones are, it's used to investigate criminal activity, and that's by law enforcement and or legal firms or potentially private investigators as well. It's used to investigate non-criminal activity. Obviously, you can hire a private investigator to investigate someone even if they're not suspected of a crime. It's also used in insurance cases for like workers' compensation or injury claims or lawsuits. And then, actually, interestingly enough, and this is something that I learned. I didn't think about it, but it makes sense. Process servers actually use it a lot to track down someone, to serve a notice, a summons, or a subpoena. So, I thought that was kind of interesting. So again, who uses social media? Obviously, like I said before, it was law enforcement, private investigators, legal firms, insurance companies, process servers. And I think really, whether or not we realize it or not, you and I can put ourselves in this category as well to an extent. If you've ever met somebody and then tried to connect with them later on social media, but maybe you don't know their last name. So for instance, if you met me, but you don't remember my last name, maybe just search Benjamin, Baltimore, Maryland, or University of Maryland. And you could, obviously you're using a search and using the search function within Facebook or maybe another platform like LinkedIn. But you may also look at potential mutual friends or mutual interests. So you're kind of using some level of investigating / forensics when you do that. I think many of us probably haven't actually realized that we do that, but definitely something that I think many of us have probably done before. So kind of really the tools and techniques I think that are used when doing social media forensics, honestly not overly complex per se. I think there's really kind of I would say an art and a science to it. I think some of it is heavily on the art of it. Obviously, there's legal parameters and things that you have to stay within, and I'll touch on that in a later slide. But really, the bulk of it, and again, I'm using Facebook as an example just because I think that's probably the most popular and most familiar for all of us. Really, you can get a very good overview of someone's post history and content and the locations that they've been, especially if that information, many times it's publicly available if people's profiles are public. Like my profile, I have some examples here. Completely public, you can look at my information. Obviously, it changes a little bit if it's private, and there's some techniques where investigators will create a mock profile and obviously try to connect with that person, and that gets into a little bit of potential violation of terms of service because you're potentially being inauthentic, and or I think there can be potential claims of not identity theft, but really kind of inauthenticity. But that's kind of a potentially separate case. But and many times all this information is publicly available. So for me, for instance, you could many times just see my interests, my beliefs, my affiliations, etc., who my friends are. You can gather information from within pictures, see where I am, see what my recent activity was, where I've been recently. For instance, you can see I like TED Talks. I posted a TED Talk. I've been to Camden Yards within the last year to watch the Orioles play. And I use play in quotations. And anyone who follows baseball knows that the Orioles aren't very good. And also, you can see I've been to St. Louis as well within the last year. There's a picture of the Gateway Arch. So these are type things where, especially I found that, like I said before, it was used for process servers where if they're tracking somebody to that they need to serve to, and this person is posting on social media, they can kind of track their whereabouts and eventually track them down. And again, the same goes for people that are investigating someone for criminal activity. You can kind of get an idea of what the person is doing and where they've been just based on their post history. You have some more advanced techniques that can vary based on the social media platform, but for instance, many phones, especially if it's not turned off, within the metadata of a picture, if it's downloaded, you actually can get GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude, and obviously put that into Google Maps or something and get a location of where that picture was taken. You also have the exchangeable image file data from digital photos that are also in there. Now, for instance, many social media platforms actually strip out this data. So Facebook does, so you don't have that information available. But that may potentially be another way of tracking where that picture was taken and being able to trace someone and where they are. You also have a very powerful tool in Google reverse image search. So if you're able to get an image, you can reverse search it to find out other places where that may have appeared, and potentially other places that Google or other pictures that Google thinks is similar, and be able to trace where a picture may be taken from that method. For instance, you can see here I plugged in a picture from a video game I play, Destiny, and obviously it found Bungie.net, the creator of Destiny, and it found obviously 326 results, and all this stuff is obviously very quick because Google is very efficient at indexing and searching. In addition, you have obviously data scrapers and parsers that can pull and really just scrape an entire profile. Now that's obviously potentially a violation of the terms of use. I know Facebook that is kind of a violation of the terms of use, terms of service. So the validity of that type of information in an investigation is debatable, but that's still potentially, depending on the platform, something that can be done as well. Something I think also that maybe is not always thought about, but is really a component of social media, is live streaming. It may not be necessarily posts and content in the traditional sense, but many people live stream everyday activities and things now, and actually there's obviously been some high profile crimes that have happened within the last few years that I think probably we're all familiar with to some level. In Chicago, you had a special needs man that was kidnapped and tortured by 4 people, and that was live streamed. So obviously that evidence would have been used in the court hearings and the investigation. And additionally, in Minnesota, you had Philando Castile, who was killed by a police officer during a traffic stop, and his girlfriend, Philando's girlfriend, live streamed the whole thing. So obviously that would be evidence that was used. So obviously not as much digging to get that evidence because it's right there, able to be used in the investigation. But still something nonetheless, that obviously the investigators would take and would look into. So just kind of another category of social media. Kind of getting into the legality of this that I kind of spoke about earlier. It can depend on the platform that's being used and the terms of service. So specifically in the case of Facebook, if you're creating a profile because you want to view someone's profile that is not public, I've found that and saw that investigators would sometimes do this and try to pose as someone else to get access to that information. That's kind of really a breach of the terms of service of Facebook, which states in certain parts that you shouldn't create inauthentic profiles, and you shouldn't impersonate others, especially by using images that are not of yourself. Obviously, a investigator is not going to use a picture of themselves. They're probably going to use a picture of something else. So there's some issues there where you're kind of effectively using a false identity, and then furthermore, you could be considered some level of potentially catfishing and stuff. All these things, obviously can be reasons why evidence may be thrown out in court. And then obviously you could take it to the extreme, which has obviously been done before. I think especially for I think regards into like when they're trying to bait or entrap somebody into especially in the cases with minors and stuff where you're trying to catch somebody in the act of doing something and officers are posing as someone else. So that's potentially gray area of legality there. And I think I really found that it's really dependent on having a good social media investigations policy, which is something that I won't go into a ton here. I can go into it in the discussion, but it's something that specifically one of the sources I found said that they, in a court case, that was actually what saved them and allowed their evidence to be admitted, was this social media investigations policy. So I can talk about that in the discussion. And really, a lot of this came down to, just like many cases, proof of intent with social media posts. And really, authorship and authentication, really, if you're looking at the profile of Benjamin Carstens, is it really me that's posting this stuff, and is it really me operating that profile? And that can be potentially something that's hard to prove. That can be hard to prove in court. And here's some examples of court cases. Kind of, maybe not, well, I won't get into too much detail, but these are specific ones where actually the whole authentication piece, it was very difficult to prove. So these cases actually ultimately got the social media evidence was not able to be actually admitted in the court because of this. So, and there's some additional ones, again, I'll highlight them in the discussion about places where the evidence was actually admitted, but a lot of this comes down to being able to prove beyond a reasonable conclusion that these profiles were authentic, and the defendant was actually the one operating and posting content to those profiles. So that's kind of the main thing that I had. Like I said, I want to follow up more in discussion. This is a very wide topic, and really there's a lot of different ways that this can go, but I thought it was very interesting, mainly because there's not super advanced techniques that are necessarily being used. It's really just kind of using your creativity to kind of find information. And so I thought it was very interesting. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to the discussions. Thanks.